making video showcases backgrounds, a rainbow background for this card and more of a traditional kind of landscape background for this card. So let's have some fun with creating these today. So to create our rainbow background, we're going to be using this stamp. This is an old stamp from Hero Arts, and it's called Lattice. It's really pretty. I've used it for a lot of different things. Okay. I'm going to do two samples so you can see the difference. This is mixed media paper. It's really smooth. This is the watercolor paper that has some more texture. And let's experiment with both. I have my Versamark ink, my clear embossing powder, and notice I have my watercolors closed up because you don't want to get any embossing powder into your watercolors. So we just want to push those aside and out of the way. I don't even have my brushes out here handy. I've got to move those over to the side as well. So let's take both of these and our embossing buddy so that powder won't stick where we don't want it to stick. And something else that's really helpful if you have it is a brayer, a roller. You don't have to have this, but because the watercolor paper has ridges and things, you've really got to press in good to get your design in there. That can be very helpful to you to get a nice, smooth, even design. All right, we're going to go over this with Versamark. I just re-inked this pad, so it's got quite a bit of the Versamark ink on it. Put this on first. Help that stick better. And if I look at it under the light, I can see it a little bit. I also typically close my Versamark pad up when I start to mess with the embossing powder. I still have clear in one of these kind of, this is a Glad container, but still some of it can kind of migrate out. It's like glitter. It wants to go everywhere. I think I've pretty much got that covered. I'll set that aside and heat it when I get the other one done. You want to be sure your embossing powder is out of the way before you get your heat gun out, because that could be a disaster too. Okay, these are embossed and cooled, and I don't know that you can see the pattern on camera. That's not something that typically comes out really good on camera, but there is a pattern there, and I can see it, the white on white pattern. I'm going to be working with my size 8 brush. Any round brush will work for this. And I'm just going to start doing a rainbow, and I'm actually going to work left to right. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. In my case, though, I don't have a violet in this particular color palette. I do in my tube paints, but I'm just going to stick with what's here. And so this color is probably the closest to a violet that I have. And I wanted two of these, so I'm just going to go ahead and do the red on each one and then the orange and so forth, so I don't have to keep cleaning my brush. So let's get quite a bit of red paint going here. And when I did the other sample, I did kind of try to do it corner to corner. I'm actually going to just do it in straight lines coming down. And we'll do a little blending as we go along. But you can see how the pattern's really coming out. This is the one on the mixed media paper. And then this is the one on the watercolor paper. Let me scoop these up to be sure they're in your view. Both really showing up pretty. A little bit of darker red there. And you can see how the resisting is going. It's not picking up color where the embossing powder and embossing went. Now I'm already seeing a little bit better distinction on the one that's on watercolor paper versus mixed media paper. There's more surface to really soak in here with the watercolor paper than there is the mixed media paper, but you still get some of that effect. Okay. Clean that off. I should be using two different water things here. I tend to get into one of them. All right, and let's do some orange. Go a little faster so I can start blending better. Now while these dry, I'm going to stamp a couple of images, and I'm going to be using some distress inks. I need one more. I'm going to use wilted violet and iced spruce to create a design to put on top of these. Since I didn't have really a violet, I thought I'd try an image in violet. This is from a very old stamp set called Big Flowers that I have used and used and used over the years, but you could use any design that you wanted to put on top of your card. And the nice thing about the Distress Oxides is that you can emboss with them when they're wet. So while this is wet, I'm going to do a couple of these, I can take my clear embossing powder and sprinkle over it. Carefully here so I don't end up with powder everywhere. And then when I heat set that, I'll go ahead and do this one and then I'll do the gray one separate. You could do them all at the same time. So that's a nice feature of Distress Inks, is that you can emboss with them. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with the Ice Spruce in this larger design and then punch those out to put them on the cards. This is the one on watercolor paper. Really good saturation of color. And one thing I haven't done yet is wiped over the top of them to see if there's any thing that's going to come off that didn't stick to the embossed areas. I think it pretty much avoided the embossed areas as it went along. Okay. And then this one is the mixed media paper. The embossing really takes very well on this because it was a flatter surface, but the color saturation is not as good. But I like both of them. I can see some really interesting blending here, and I love how deep the colors are here. So this is the thing with watercolors, is you don't know what you're going to get. And for somebody like me who really likes a predictable outcome, I'm kind of surprised how much I enjoy not knowing what's going to happen. I think part of it is that I'm making more cards than I probably need these days, so if I make something that doesn't work out, it's okay. I can say, well, that one's not a very good one. I've got a lot of supplies. I'm wanting to use the supplies, so I don't mind doing a little bit of experimenting and having a little bit of fun with them. And you get some very interesting things, stuff that you just never would have thought of as you're working with watercolors. Now I went ahead and put together these two sort of medallions. I chose the purple because I didn't really have purple. And I can do them this way, or I could flip them over. Let's see. Try them that way. No, I think I like the red on top in both cases. And I wanted, when I did this one, I stamped hello right on it, but I got it too high up, and it messed up my design. So I want to go ahead and stamp hello, but I need something to indicate where it's going to go. And I'm going to use archival ink for this. And you can stamp right on top of your embossed surface, and came out really good the last time, so we'll see how it does this time. I don't have a completely flat surface underneath. I hope that won't mess me up. Okay. I ran out of room on my memory card on the camera right when I was stamping hello on here, but I promise you that when I stamped it, it came out nice and clean. I didn't make a mistake and go back and redo everything. It stamped really great on both of these cards. But again, I got a little high on this one like I had here. So what I did was just go ahead and put my design on, and then I used some washi tape to kind of balance the look. But I've got cards with, I changed the order here in the way I laid them out. And different kinds of paper. This is the one that's on the mixed media paper, and then both of these are on watercolor paper, and so you get some slightly different looks with each one. So now let's move on and do a background that is what is going to be kind of a landscape background for a card. To make this card, we need to create a background, and then we'll be stamping and embossing an image over the top of that background. So I just want a blue sky and a green grass type of look. You could create a whole sunset type of look as well, adding in maybe some yellow and some peach into that. And I'm just going to do a simple blue and green. This would be a really good background also for things like a card where maybe you had house images or something that you wanted to put on there, or even just a flower. It makes a nice natural looking background. So to start, this is going to be a wet on wet technique. Don't throw our brush, just dropped mine. But I'm going to start, I'm using my size 10 brush. You could use an 8 brush, doesn't matter. And I'm taking a piece of watercolor paper. This is one where I was running really low on the Strathmore paper, so I've used an even less expensive paper. This is Canson watercolor paper you can find in the craft stores. It's a really good practice paper for watercolor, but you can use it for a lot of techniques as well, and it works for this. So I'm just going to get the back of this really wet, and you'll see why I've got it on a paper towel here in a moment to help sort of soak up some excess water. So with it wet, now let's start adding a little bit of blue. If you have a set that has, a lighter blue color in there, you could do that. I'm going to be starting with dark and then just adding some water to lighten it up. And you can kind of tip it up and let it drip down as you go if you want. You're just spreading the color around. I don't want it to get all the way down to the bottom. Keep it up towards the top. Now, in watercolor videos, they would encourage you to tape your watercolor paper to a surface around the edges. you can certainly do that. I usually try to make sure my cardstock is maybe just a tad larger, at least on one direction, than what I'm going to want in the end. I want to trim some of it off, but it doesn't bother me that it's going to warp a little bit because I'm going to be attaching it to a card. And I want this a little bit dark because I'm going to be stamping and embossing in white embossing powder. But see, if this were laying flat, I wouldn't have that kind of bleed at the top. But that's okay. I'm probably going to trim this down a little bit when I get done with it. Now you can also kind of wet your brush, make sure it's clean, and start to sort of push some of the blue away and creates almost some cloud type of effects. Kind of vary the skyline if you like, or you can just kind of make it an all over blue. Okay. I'm going to turn it around here and make sure I have a clean brush and start pulling in some green. Now I want to let this dry really, really good because when we emboss on it, we don't want anything wet, or our embossing powder is going to stick to whatever's wet. So this one, I can use the heat gun, but I'm probably just going to let this one air dry, and then we'll come back to it and we'll add the embossing. Okay, so this is good and dry. And I'm going to use my powder over this to keep it from sticking. I've had this for, gosh, I started to say decades, but at least a decade from Stampin' Up, more than that. And it still works fine. And this is the stamp that I'm going to use. This is an old set from Stampin' Up called Upsy Daisy. And we're using Versamark ink. I've got my white embossing powder standing by. What I want to do is stamp the daisies here. And I can kind of see where they're stamped at. And then I'm going to add a few more to the end stamped. So, that's my light to guide me. There we are. Okay. So now that's stamped. And let's take some white embossing powder. Now, see that how that blue has bled up there at the top a little bit? I'm going to take that to the paper trimmer and trim this off some because this is a little bit large. I just don't really want it to be quite that big. I'm looking for a little bit smaller one anyway. So when you're doing these kind of backgrounds, if you start with a little bit larger paper, you don't necessarily have to tape it down. And the fact that it's not laying perfectly flat isn't going to be a big deal for me because I'm going to use adhesive around the edges. So let me wrap up this card. All I would need to finish this is to tie the bow around it, And to adhere it to the cardstock, what I would use is some dimensional adhesive, or you could put regular adhesive. Just make sure that you get the corners good. On this one, all I did was 4 dimensionals, 1 in each corner, and it's laying just fine. And the same thing would happen here if we're finishing this card off right now. And I really kind of like the background better because I've got it a little bit darker in places, and I think it shows up the flowers very nicely. They're never going to be the same. You're always going to have some variations from one card to another.